The morning fog hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, stood at the tall windows of her private quarters. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the delicate china teacup, steam rising into the cool air of early autumn. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible burden that had been building for months. Prince William found her there, as he had every morning for the past week. His usually confident stride had become measured, careful, as if sudden movements might shatter the fragile composure they both desperately maintained. The silence between them spoke of shared understanding, of a decision that had taken everything they had to make. The royal couple had always been masters of public composure, their faces trained from years of scrutiny to reveal nothing of their inner turmoil. Yet behind closed doors, away from the cameras and the constant watchful eyes of the press, they were simply a husband and wife facing the most difficult challenge of their marriage. Catherine set down her cup with deliberate precision, the small clink against the saucer echoing in the quiet room. She turned to face William, and, for a moment, their carefully constructed masks slipped. The pain in her green eyes was unmistakable, reflecting a sorrow so deep that words seemed inadequate to express it. The decision they faced was not theirs alone to make, yet the burden of it rested squarely on their shoulders. Duty had always been the cornerstone of their lives, the foundation upon which their marriage and their roles as senior royals had been built. But duty, they were learning, sometimes demanded sacrifices that cut to the very core of who they were as people. William reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become their anchor in the storm of uncertainty. They had held hands like this on their wedding day, promising to face whatever came together. They had never imagined that promise would be tested in such a profound way. The palace had been unusually quiet in recent weeks, as if the very walls sensed the gravity of what was unfolding within them. Staff members moved with hushed efficiency, their usual chatter replaced by respectful silence. Everyone knew something significant was happening, though few understood the full scope of the decision being contemplated. Catherine's mind drifted to the conversations that had led them to this point. Late-night discussions in their private study, voices kept low despite the soundproof walls. William's struggle with reconciling his heart with his duty was evident in the way his jaw tightened when certain topics arose, the way his eyes grew distant when he thought she wasn't looking. The children had noticed the change in their parents, though Catherine and William had worked tirelessly to shield them from the weight of royal obligation that seemed to press down on everything they touched. George, Charlotte, and Louis continued their daily routines, but their innocent questions had become more pointed, their young minds picking up on the subtle shifts in household dynamics. Morning walks through the palace gardens had become Catherine's refuge. The carefully manicured paths offered her a sense of peace that the grand rooms inside could not provide. It was during one of these walks that she had come to understand the true cost of the choice before them. The realization had hit her with such force that she had to steady herself against an ancient oak tree, its solid trunk offering the support her legs suddenly refused to provide. William found her there that day, tears streaming down her face for the first time since the crisis had begun. He didn't ask what had brought her to that breaking point. He simply wrapped his arms around her and held her as she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of their situation. The press had begun to sense that something was amiss. Royal correspondents who had covered the family for years noted subtle changes in public appearances. The way Catherine's smile seemed to require more effort. The way William's answers to routine questions carried an undertone of weariness that hadn't been there before. Speculation began to swirl in the tabloids, wild theories about marital problems or health scares filling column inches with breathless prose. The reality was both simpler and more complex than anything the gossip mills could conjure. It was about love and duty, about the impossible choices that came with wearing a crown, even one that hadn't yet been placed upon their heads. Palace advisors had presented them with options, each carrying its own set of consequences. Legal experts had been consulted, constitutional scholars had weighed in, and still the burden of choice remained with Catherine and William alone. They were the ones who would have to live with whatever decision they made, the ones who would have to look their children in the eye and explain why their lives were about to change forever. The international implications of their choice were staggering. Commonwealth nations watched and waited, their own constitutional arrangements hanging in the balance. Diplomatic channels buzzed with quiet inquiries about what the future might hold. The stability that the monarchy represented to millions of people around the world suddenly felt fragile, dependent on the decision of two people sitting in a quiet room, holding hands, and trying to find a path forward. Catherine's role as a mother had taken on new significance in recent weeks. Every bedtime story she read to Louis, every homework session with Charlotte, every cricket match she watched George play carried additional weight. These moments of normalcy felt precious beyond measure, possibly numbered in ways that made her heart ache. The formal announcement was still days away, but the preparation for it had begun. Speech writers worked on drafts that would never capture the true emotion behind the words. Protocol officers planned ceremonies that would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The machinery of state began its slow turn toward accommodation of whatever choice the royal couple would make. William's relationship with his father had grown complicated in ways that surprised them both. Charles, now king, understood duty in ways that few people could comprehend, yet he also understood the pull of personal happiness, having fought his own battles between heart and crown decades earlier. Their conversations had taken on a new depth, two men grappling with the expectations of an institution that demanded everything while promising very little in return. The quiet moments between Catherine and William had become precious beyond measure. Simple conversations over breakfast carried new weight, plans for the future spoken in hypotheticals rather than certainties. They had learned to communicate in glances and gestures, their bond deepening even as the pressure to make an impossible choice threatened to tear apart everything they had built together. As the first part of their journey toward an unimaginable farewell began, Catherine and William found themselves clinging to each other with a desperation born of love and fear in equal measure. The path ahead remained unclear, but they would walk it together, their silent sorrow speaking volumes to a world that watched and waited for answers that might change everything they thought they knew about duty, love, and the price of wearing a crown. The weight of tradition pressed down upon Kensington Palace like a suffocating blanket as Catherine stood in the grand drawing room, her fingers tracing the edges of a leather-bound journal that had belonged to Diana. The pages contained thoughts and reflections from a woman who had faced her own impossible choices, whose legacy continued to shape the very decision that Catherine and William now confronted. William paced near the fireplace, his movements restless and agitated in ways that spoke to the internal battle raging within him. The confident prince who had once seemed so sure of his destiny now appeared lost, caught between the weight of expectation and the pull of something deeper, more personal than duty had ever demanded. The conversation with his father the previous evening had left William emotionally drained. King Charles had listened with the patience of a man who understood the complexity of royal obligation, yet his words carried the unmistakable undertone of expectation. The crown, Charles had reminded his son, was not merely a symbol but a responsibility to millions of people who looked to the monarchy for stability and continuity. Catherine had witnessed the conversation from the doorway, her heart breaking as she watched William struggle to articulate feelings that seemed to tear him apart from within. The young man who had once swept her off her feet at university, who had proposed on a mountaintop in Kenya with such joy and certainty, now seemed aged beyond his years by the burden of choice. The children's laughter echoed through the corridors, a sound that both comforted and tormented their parents. George had begun to ask more pointed questions about why Mommy and Daddy seemed sad, his young mind unable to grasp the magnitude of what his parents were considering. Charlotte, ever perceptive, had taken to following Catherine around the palace, as if sensing that their time together in this place might be limited. Palace staff had begun to notice the changes in routine. Private secretaries found themselves adjusting schedules with unusual frequency, public engagements were subtly modified, and the normal rhythm of royal life began to feel forced, artificial. Those who had served the family for years recognized the signs of a household in transition, though none dared to voice their observations aloud. The media attention had intensified, royal correspondents sensing a story beneath the surface of official statements and carefully staged public appearances. Photographers captured images of Catherine looking pensively out of car windows, of William's jaw clenched in concentration during what should have been routine public engagements. The speculation grew wilder with each passing day, theories ranging from health scares to marital discord filling the gossip columns. In the privacy of their bedroom, Catherine and William found themselves having conversations that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. They spoke in whispers about alternative futures, about lives that might exist beyond the golden cage of royal obligation. These discussions were painful, filled with the recognition that choices made in the pursuit of happiness might have consequences that extended far beyond their own lives. Catherine's relationship with her own family had become a source of both comfort and confusion. Her parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, had built their lives around the understanding that their daughter would one day be queen. The prospect of that future changing fundamentally challenged assumptions that had governed family relationships for more than a decade. The constitutional experts who advised the palace painted a picture of unprecedented complexity. The last time a senior royal had faced such a choice, it had resulted in a constitutional crisis that had reshaped the monarchy itself. Edward VIII's abdication had created ripple effects that were still felt decades later, and the prospect of another member of the direct line of succession making a similar choice sent shockwaves through the establishment. William's military background had taught him to analyze situations from multiple angles, to consider consequences and contingencies before making decisions. Yet this choice defied such analytical approaches. It was about the heart as much as the head, about personal fulfillment as much as duty, about the kind of people they wanted to be versus the roles they had been born to fill. The Commonwealth realms watched nervously as rumors swirled about potential changes to the line of succession. Prime ministers and governor-generals fielded questions from their own governments about what might happen if the traditional order were to be disrupted. The stability that the monarchy represented to these nations suddenly felt fragile, dependent on personal choices being made behind palace walls. Catherine found herself drawn repeatedly to the portraits that lined the palace walls, images of queens and princesses who had faced their own challenges and made their own sacrifices. Some had thrived within the confines of royal life, finding purpose and fulfillment in service to others. Others had struggled, their personal happiness sacrificed on the altar of duty and expectation. The weight of history felt particularly heavy during formal dinners and state occasions. Catherine would catch William's eye across crowded rooms, their silent communication speaking volumes about the disconnect they felt between the pageantry surrounding them and the very human struggle taking place within their hearts. Sleep had become elusive for both of them. They would lie awake in the darkness, hands clasped together, each lost in thoughts too complex for words. The future that had once seemed so clear, so predetermined, now appeared as a series of branching paths, each leading to destinations they could barely imagine. Their children's innocence served as both a comfort and a burden. George's excitement about his future role as king, Charlotte's delight in princess dresses, Louis's simple joy in palace life. All of these things would be affected by whatever decision their parents ultimately made. The responsibility they felt toward their children's futures added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. The legal implications alone were staggering. Teams of lawyers worked quietly behind the scenes, exploring precedents and possibilities, trying to map out potential scenarios that might allow for unprecedented choices while maintaining constitutional stability. The complexity of these arrangements required discretion that added to the pressure already weighing on Catherine and William. Public appearances had become exercises in carefully controlled performance. Catherine's smile never wavered during charity events. William's responses to questions remained measured and appropriate, yet those who knew them well could see the strain beginning to show. The mask of royal composure, worn so naturally for so many years, now required conscious effort to maintain. The international dimension of their situation added diplomatic complexity that neither had fully anticipated. Foreign governments watched carefully for signs of instability within the British monarchy, their own relationships with the United Kingdom potentially affected by whatever changes might come. The personal choice facing Catherine and William carried implications that stretched across continents and affected relationships between nations. As the second phase of their journey toward an unthinkable farewell continued, the royal couple found themselves caught between worlds. One foot in the life they had always known, another tentatively placed toward a future that remained frighteningly uncertain. The silence between them continued to speak volumes, their shared sorrow deepening even as their resolve began to crystallize around a choice that would change everything forever. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Sandringham House as Catherine sat in the small study that had become her sanctuary during the most difficult weeks of her life. The familiar surroundings that had once brought her comfort now felt like a museum of memories, each photograph and personal item a reminder of the life she and William were preparing to leave behind. The decision had been made in the quiet hours before dawn 3 days earlier, as they lay in bed listening to the sound of their children's peaceful breathing through the baby monitor. William had spoken the words that had been hanging between them for weeks, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to choose ourselves this time." Catherine had simply nodded, tears streaming down her face, knowing that the moment they had both dreaded and somehow longed for had finally arrived. The mechanics of royal abdication, they discovered, were far more complex than either had imagined. Constitutional lawyers worked around the clock to establish precedents, drawing from historical documents that had gathered dust for decades. The Abdication Act of 1936 provided some guidance, but the circumstances surrounding Edward VIII's choice were vastly different from the situation Catherine and William now faced. King Charles received the news with a dignity that spoke to his own understanding of the burden they had carried. His reaction was not one of anger or disappointment, but of profound sadness mixed with something that might have been relief. As a father, he had watched his son struggle with the weight of expectation, and, as a monarch, he understood better than most the personal cost of wearing a crown. The ripple effects of their decision began immediately. Private secretaries worked frantically to manage the transition, while constitutional experts debated the implications for the line of succession. Prince Harry, despite his own complicated relationship with royal life, found himself thrust back into the center of discussions about duty and service to the crown. Catherine's transformation from duchess to private citizen would require careful orchestration. The charities she had championed, the patronages she had nurtured, the public appearances that had defined her role, all would need to be transferred to other members of the royal family. The thought of explaining to the children and young people she had worked with that she would no longer be their royal patron brought fresh waves of grief. William's military honors and ceremonial roles presented their own complications. The uniforms that hung in his dressing room, each representing a different aspect of his service to the crown, would soon be returned to their respective regiments. The thought of never again wearing the red tunic of the Welsh Guards or the naval uniform that connected him to his grandfather's legacy felt like losing pieces of his identity. The children's future had to be carefully considered and protected. George, Charlotte, and Louis would retain their places in the line of succession, but their day-to-day lives would change dramatically. Private schools would need to be found, security arrangements would be modified, and the careful balance between public duty and private childhood would shift entirely toward the latter. Palace staff faced their own uncertain futures. Personal protection officers who had devoted years to safeguarding the family, household staff who had become extended family, private secretaries who had managed every aspect of their public lives. All would need to find new roles within the royal household or seek employment elsewhere entirely. The media response, when it finally came, was explosive. Royal correspondents who had spent decades covering the family struggled to find adequate words for such an unprecedented event. The phones at Buckingham Palace rang constantly as news organizations around the world sought comment on what many were calling the most significant constitutional change since the abdication crisis of 1936. Commonwealth nations reacted with varying degrees of shock and concern. The stability that the monarchy had provided for generations suddenly felt threatened, not by scandal or incompetence, but by the very human desire of two people to choose their own path in life. Prime ministers and governor-generals held emergency meetings to discuss the implications for their own constitutional arrangements. The financial implications were staggering. Properties would need to be returned to the Crown estate, staff salaries and pensions would need to be addressed, and the complex web of trusts and investments that supported royal life would need to be unwound. Lawyers and accountants worked through the night to create a framework for the most expensive divorce in British constitutional history, a divorce from the Crown itself. Catherine found herself spending hours in the palace's portrait gallery, studying the faces of queens and princesses who had come before her. She wondered what choices they might have made if presented with the same opportunity, whether any of them had dreamed of a life beyond the constraints of royal protocol. The weight of letting them down, of breaking a chain of service that stretched back centuries, sat heavily on her conscience. William's relationship with his military colleagues became particularly poignant during this transition period. The men and women who had served alongside him in Afghanistan, who had seen him as a fellow soldier rather than a future king, struggled to understand how he could walk away from the ultimate expression of service to country. Their confusion and disappointment added another layer of complexity to an already emotionally charged situation. The question of titles became a source of unexpected emotion. Catherine had grown accustomed to being addressed as Your Royal Highness, had found purpose in the respect recognition that came with her position. The prospect of returning to being simply Catherine Middleton felt both liberating and terrifying, a loss of identity that she hadn't fully anticipated. Public reaction, when the news finally broke, was mixed and passionate. Some expressed admiration for the courage it took to choose personal happiness over duty, while others felt betrayed by what they saw as an abandonment of responsibility. Protesters gathered outside palace gates, some supporting the decision, others demanding that William fulfill his obligations to the crown. The international royal families watched nervously as the British monarchy navigated uncharted waters. The Queen of Denmark, the King of Sweden, the monarchs of smaller European nations, all had to consider what message this unprecedented choice might send about the relevance and sustainability of hereditary monarchy in the modern world. Security concerns added urgency to the transition planning. As private citizens, Catherine and William would lose the comprehensive protection that had surrounded them since their marriage. New arrangements would need to be made, discreet but effective, to ensure their safety and that of their children as they adapted to life outside the royal bubble. The psychological impact on the children became a primary concern for both parents. Child psychologists were quietly consulted about how to help young minds process such a dramatic change in circumstances. The challenge of maintaining some sense of normalcy, while completely appending everything they had known about their lives, required delicate handling and professional guidance. As the third phase of their journey toward an unprecedented farewell continued, Catherine and William found themselves caught between grief for what they were losing and excitement about what they might gain. The silence between them had evolved from sorrow to understanding. Their shared experience of choosing the unknown over the predetermined, creating a bond that was somehow stronger than what they had shared before. The world watched and waited, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of the choice they had made or the courage it had required to make it. The final preparations for their departure from royal life took on an almost surreal quality as Catherine stood in her dressing room at Kensington Palace, carefully folding clothes that would no longer require the attention of a lady's maid. Each item told a story of the life she was leaving behind. The Alexander McQueen coat dress from a state dinner, the casual jeans she had worn to visit homeless shelters, the tiara that would never again grace her head at a palace reception. William found the process of returning his military ceremonial uniforms particularly difficult. Each piece represented years of service, connections to regiments that had welcomed him as one of their own, and traditions that stretched back through generations of his family. The act of placing his colonel-in-chief uniforms back in their protective covers felt like closing chapters of a book that had defined much of his adult identity. The children's reactions to the news had been as varied as their personalities. George, at his young age, struggled to understand why Daddy wouldn't be king after Grandpapa, his questions innocent, yet cutting straight to the heart of the sacrifice being made. Charlotte seemed to sense the gravity of the situation more keenly, staying closer to her parents and asking fewer questions, but watching everything with wide, observant eyes. Louis, still too young to fully grasp the implications, continued his daily routines with the resilience that young children possess. King Charles had requested a private dinner with his son and daughter-in-law before their official departure from royal duties. The meal, served in the intimate setting of Clarence House's smaller dining room, was both celebratory and somber. Charles spoke eloquently about the courage required to choose authenticity over expectation, drawing parallels to his own long journey toward the throne and the personal sacrifices he had made along the way. The formal announcement to the public had been crafted with extraordinary care, every word weighed for its constitutional implications and emotional impact. When William read the statement aloud to the gathered media, his voice remained steady despite the magnitude of what he was declaring. Catherine stood beside him, her composure never wavering even as photographers captured what would become one of the most significant images in modern royal history. Public reaction exceeded all expectations in its intensity and complexity. Social media exploded with opinions ranging from heartfelt support to bitter criticism. Hashtags trended worldwide as people debated the nature of duty, the relevance of monarchy, and the right of individuals to choose their own destiny regardless of the circumstances of their birth. The conversation transcended national boundaries, touching on fundamental questions about tradition, obligation, and personal freedom. The logistics of transitioning 3 children from royal to private status required extraordinary attention to detail. New schools had to be identified and vetted, Security protocols had to be established that would protect them without the overwhelming presence they had grown accustomed to. And, perhaps most importantly, counselors had to help them understand why their lives were changing so dramatically. Catherine's charitable work had become deeply personal over the years, and the process of transferring her patronages to other members of the royal family brought unexpected grief. The early years foundation she had established would continue under new leadership, but stepping away from the project that had become her passion felt like losing a piece of herself. The letters from children and families whose lives had been touched by her work served as both comfort and reminder of the impact she was leaving behind. The Commonwealth realms faced constitutional crises of varying degrees as they grappled with the implications of William's decision. Some nations began discussions about severing their ties to the British Crown entirely, while others moved quickly to update their succession laws to account for the unprecedented situation. The ripple effects of two people choosing personal happiness over hereditary duty were being felt across continents. William's final military duties carried particular emotional weight. His last inspection of troops, his final appearance at a regimental dinner, his goodbye to fellow officers who had seen him as both colleague and future commander-in-chief. These moments were preserved in photographs that captured the profound sadness of endings alongside the dignity of service faithfully completed. The question of where they would live after leaving royal residences had been settled through the purchase of a country estate in Norfolk, far from the constant scrutiny of London, but close enough to maintain relationships with family and friends. The house, while substantial by ordinary standards, felt modest compared to the palaces they were leaving behind. Its most important feature was its privacy, surrounded by enough land to provide the children with space to grow up away from telephoto lenses and public curiosity. Palace staff faced their own difficult transitions. Many had devoted their entire careers to serving the royal family, and the prospect of their positions being eliminated or transferred brought uncertainty to dozens of families. Catherine and William worked personally with each staff member to ensure appropriate references and, where possible, placement in other royal households or assistance in finding new employment. The media speculation about their future plans reached fever pitch in the weeks leading up to their departure. Would William return to his career as an air ambulance pilot? Would Catherine pursue the university education she had set aside for royal duties? Would they relocate to another country entirely? The questions multiplied faster than answers could be provided, creating a constant buzz of speculation that followed them wherever they went. International royal families sent private messages of support, understanding the unique pressures that came with hereditary monarchy in the modern world. Some shared their own struggles with balancing personal desires against public expectation, creating a network of support from those who truly understood the weight of crowns and the courage required to set them aside. The legal framework for their departure required unprecedented constitutional innovation. Lawyers worked with parliamentary authorities to create legislation that would formalize their choice while maintaining the stability of the succession. The process revealed gaps in existing law that no one had anticipated, requiring creative solutions to problems that had never before required consideration. Their final weeks as working royals were filled with goodbye visits to organizations and charities they had supported. Each appearance carried additional emotional weight, as Catherine and William said farewell not just to their roles, but to the people who had made those roles meaningful. The thank you speeches they delivered at these events were heartfelt and personal in ways that royal protocol typically discouraged. Financial arrangements required delicate negotiation between personal lawyers and the royal household. Questions about pensions, property, and ongoing security costs had to be resolved in ways that protected both their future well-being and the interests of the tax-paying public. The complexity of extricating themselves from the financial structure of royal life proved nearly as challenging as the emotional aspects of their decision. As the fourth phase of their unprecedented farewell drew to a close, Catherine and William found themselves looking forward for the first time in months rather than backward. The grief of leaving was being joined by anticipation of what lay ahead. Their silent sorrow was beginning to be tempered by quiet hope, their shared journey toward an unknown future strengthening the bond between them as they prepared for the final act of their transformation from royals to private citizens. The morning of their final official engagement dawned crisp and clear, autumn sunshine streaming through the windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine and William prepared for what would be their last appearance as senior working members of the royal family. The irony was not lost on either of them that their final duty was a celebration of service to others, a fitting conclusion to years dedicated to causes greater than themselves. Catherine's choice of outfit for this momentous day had been deliberate and deeply personal. The navy dress she wore was one she had selected for her first solo engagement as a duchess, creating a circle of symmetry that seemed appropriate for such a significant ending. Her jewelry was minimal, the engagement ring that had belonged to William's mother, and simple pearl earrings that had been a wedding gift from the Queen. William wore his military dress uniform one final time, the weight of the medals and insignia feeling heavier than usual as he fastened each piece with the precision that had been drilled into him over years of service. The irony that he was wearing symbols of duty and honor while preparing to step away from the ultimate expression of both was not lost on him. Yet he felt a sense of rightness about honoring these traditions one last time. The children had been prepared for this day with the help of child psychologists and counselors, but nothing could fully prepare young minds for saying goodbye to the only life they had ever known. George clutched his father's hand tightly as they walked through the palace corridors, his young face serious with an understanding beyond his years. Charlotte and Louis followed behind, their chatter subdued by the unusual gravity of the adults around them. The final engagement was a visit to a children's hospital, a choice that reflected their shared commitment to causes that had defined their royal careers. Catherine's work with early childhood development and William's focus on mental health support came together in this one last official act of service. The children and families they met had no idea they were witnessing history, seeing the last official moments of a royal couple who had chosen love and authenticity over crown and duty. The hospital visit proceeded with all the warmth and genuine connection that had characterized their approach to royal duties throughout their marriage. Catherine knelt beside hospital beds to speak with young patients, her natural empathy undiminished by the emotional weight of the day. William shared jokes with teenage patients, his easy manner helping them forget their circumstances for a few precious moments. The photographers and journalists covering the event sensed the significance of the moment, their cameras capturing images that would become iconic representations of a unique moment in royal history. The pictures showed a couple fully engaged in their work, their faces reflecting the same commitment to service that had defined their years as senior royals, making their choice to step away all the more poignant. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Catherine found herself overwhelmed by emotion for the first time that day. A young girl receiving treatment for leukemia had asked if she would come back to visit, and Catherine's promise that she would always care, even if she couldn't return in an official capacity, brought tears to her eyes that she quickly composed herself to hide. The drive back to Kensington Palace was conducted in contemplative silence, the children dozing in their car seats while Catherine and William held hands and watched the London landscape pass by. This familiar journey, one they had made hundreds of times over the years, felt different now. They were seeing it all through the lens of goodbye, noting details they might never have occasion to observe again. Their final private moments in the palace were spent in the nursery where their children had taken their first steps, spoken their first words, and grown from babies into the remarkable young people they were becoming. The room that had been filled with royal nannies and security personnel now felt intimate and personal, a space where they had been allowed to be simply parents rather than public figures. The formal ceremony of returning their royal warrants and ceremonial items was conducted in the throne room, with only immediate family present to witness this unprecedented moment in constitutional history. King Charles personally accepted the items that symbolized their departure from royal duty, his face reflecting the complex emotions of a father watching his son choose a different path, while simultaneously respecting the courage that choice required. Catherine's removal of her royal titles felt more symbolic than practical. She had never been one to insist on protocol or formality in private settings. Yet the moment when she was addressed as simply Catherine rather than Your Royal Highness for the first time in over a decade marked a threshold that could never be crossed back over. The children's reactions to leaving the palace were as individual as their personalities. George asked numerous questions about their new house and whether he would still see his grandfather the king regularly. Charlotte seemed to understand intuitively that this was a new beginning rather than just an ending, her natural optimism helping to lighten the mood for everyone around her. Louis, still young enough to adapt quickly to change, was primarily excited about the prospect of having a dog in their new home. The media coverage of their departure was extensive and global, with news crews from around the world positioned outside palace gates to capture the historic moment when a future king and queen chose private life over public service. The images of their car leaving Kensington Palace for the final time would be replayed countless times, analyzed for every detail of emotion and significance. Public reaction to their final day continued to be deeply divided. Social media platforms overflowed with comments ranging from admiration for their courage to criticism of their abandonment of duty. The debate touched on fundamental questions about the nature of service, the relevance of hereditary monarchy, and the right of individuals to determine their own destiny regardless of the circumstances of their birth. International news coverage placed their decision in the context of broader questions about monarchy and democracy in the modern world. Constitutional scholars from universities around the globe offered analysis of the precedent being set and its potential implications for other royal families facing similar pressures between tradition and personal fulfillment. Their new home in Norfolk awaited them with the promise of privacy and normalcy that had been impossible to achieve within the constraints of royal life. The house, while comfortable and substantial, offered something palace life never could: the opportunity to live without constant scrutiny, to make decisions based on family needs rather than public expectation, to discover who they were when stripped of titles and ceremony. The transition to private life would not be immediate or simple. Security arrangements still needed to be maintained, albeit at a reduced level. Educational decisions for the children required careful consideration of their unique circumstances. Financial planning had to account for the loss of royal income while ensuring their long-term security and independence. William's plans to return to meaningful work outside the royal framework had been carefully developed during the months of preparation for this transition. His experience as an air ambulance pilot, combined with his mental health advocacy work, positioned him well for a career in emergency services or healthcare management. The prospect of work chosen for its personal meaning rather than constitutional obligation energized him in ways he hadn't felt for years. Catherine's future remained more open, a blank canvas of possibility that both excited and intimidated her. The education she had paused to fulfill royal duties could be resumed. The career paths she had never explored now lay open before her. The freedom to choose based on passion rather than protocol was a gift she was only beginning to understand how to use. As their car pulled into the driveway of their new home, Catherine and William looked at each other with expressions that reflected the complete emotional journey they had traveled together. The silent sorrow that had characterized the beginning of this process had evolved into something more complex: grief for what they had left behind, mixed with anticipation for what lay ahead, tempered by the deep satisfaction that came from making choices aligned with their authentic selves. The children ran into their new house with the excitement typical of young people discovering a new environment, their voices echoing through rooms that would soon be filled with the normal chaos of family life. For Catherine and William, following behind them, the sound represented hope, the possibility of raising their children in an environment where they could discover their own paths without the weight of predetermined destiny. Their farewell to royal life was complete, but their journey together was just beginning. The world had watched them choose love over duty, authenticity over expectation, personal happiness over public service. In doing so, they had challenged assumptions about sacrifice and obligation while demonstrating that even the most privileged lives came with the fundamental human right to choose one's own path. Their silent sorrow had spoken volumes, and now their quiet joy would have the chance to do the same.